Okay, everybody, let's get started. We're going to do number 57 now. US enters World War I. All right, so from last year, you know that World War I began in Europe in August of 1914 with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And the importance of that whole incident for American history is to remember the war is raging in Europe for about 3 years before the United States does get involved. So we do maintain our neutrality and isolationism for a number of years before we jump in to the Great War in Europe. So when the war breaks out, you have a series of two sides, I guess you could say. You have the Allied powers. They're represented by this kind of orange, tannish color, I guess you'd say, right? You have France, England, and Russia at the time. And then the pink are the Central Powers, Turkey, Austria-Hungary, and Germany. And you can see from the German position, they're not in a strategically positive position, right? They're located between, they're squeezed between their enemies on the Western Front and their enemies in the Eastern Front. So that's something that we'll talk about as time goes on and has a lot to do with U.S. involvement in the war in Europe. So the president at the time is Woodrow Wilson. He's a Democrat, a progressive, and he is very much against war, and he wants to maintain the traditional U.S. policy of neutrality. The quote, "The United States must be neutral in fact as well as in name during these days that are to try men's souls. We must be impartial in thought as well as in action. Must put a curb upon our sentiments as well as upon every transaction that might be construed as a preference of one party to the struggle before another." So his goal is to maintain that traditional idea of American neutrality. But we are trading with Europe, all right? So the U.S. is continuing to trade. We're not in the war, but we're going to trade with European powers, not only the British, but the French and the Germans and other European countries. So Americans are trading not only food, but war materials, all right? And the economy in America is gaining a huge boost from the war in Europe. So just taking a look at this chart right now, all right, we can see some of the trends that are going on. So if we were to note, so looking at this chart, right, we should notice something dramatic that happens around 1914, right? Between 1914 and 1915, right around here. You're seeing this dramatic drop-off of German trade, all right? And we're going to discuss that. So what happens is the Allies, right, Britain and France are allies. The Allies continue to get American trade, while the Germans get less and less and almost negligible at the end. So what happens in this period of time to change all that? And we have to talk about it, all right? So in 1914, there was $70 million in trade with the Central Powers, right? The powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Turkey. That trade by 1916 was reduced to 1.3 million. All right. So, and Allied trade, it grew from 825 million to 3.2 billion in the same period. So the Allies are increasing their spending in American goods, and the Central Powers, they're declining. So are we really acting as a neutral power? You could say we are, because we're trying to trade with everybody, but we just can't. I'll explain why we can't in a second. The other thing I wanted to make sure everyone understood is that one of the problems for these Allied powers, they didn't have any money, so they had to borrow from American banks. And so we went from being a debtor nation to a creditor nation as a result of the war in Europe. Okay, so kind of set the background, the context of what's going on, and we have to move from, obviously, we know the end point. We know the United States gets involved in World War I. So we have to move from how we weren't involved to how did we get involved over that 3-year span from August of 1914 to April of 1917. What pushed the American government and the American people towards the war in Europe? All right, so the first thing was one of the goals of, and this is super important, all right, one of the goals of the Germans was to stop trade between the United States and their enemies, the French and the English, all right? Because if we remember from the chart before, the Germans were not able to get American trade, and there's a reason for that. I'm going to show you that right now. Okay, so as the war began, the English, with their navy, they figured that they could blockade any trade to Germany. So they put their naval ships here, and they put their naval ships here. And now, if you're trying to get ships from the United States to Germany, you have to pass these British blockades. Well, that's impossible. So our trade with Germany ends. All right, our trade with Germany becomes negligible. We're not able to trade with Germany. So we're trading only with the Allies. We're trading with England. We're trading with France. Well, that is not going to work if you're the Germans. You can't allow that to happen. So what the Germans do is they begin to build and send submarines out beyond the blockade to stop American ships from entering British waters or French waters. All right. So what goes on here, these, like we said before, these two areas are shut down now, right? They're stopped. So what we're going to do is, if we're the Germans, is we're going to take our submarines and we're going to patrol out here and we're going to patrol over here and we're going to try to make sure that these ships from America don't end up getting to our enemies. So what happens? These German submarines begin to sink American ships, all right? And that violated our belief in freedom of the seas. So this unrestricted submarine warfare, where German subs could just sink an American ship because it was traveling to Britain, becomes a huge deal in the United States because American sailors are being killed, American trade is being disrupted. But the Germans are just trying to protect themselves. So it's a situation where, although we're claiming neutrality, we're not really being neutral because we can only trade with Britain and France. And as a result, the Germans have to do something, they believe. And that's why they begin to use submarines. So if there's one thing you can remember about this, is that the submarine issue is one of the main reasons for American involvement in the war in Europe. In 1915, a German submarine sank a British passenger ship, the Lusitania, killing 1,000, including 128 Americans. One of the things that's pretty fascinating about this story is the Germans had actually notified Americans not to sail on the ship. There was a ad on this side here showing the ad in American papers. Said, if you're a traveler intending on a voyage across the Atlantic, do not go on ships that have British flags. The Lusitania was sunk and Americans were killed. But even after the Lusitania, Americans wanted to stay out of the war. Remember, we don't go to the war until April of 1917, and this is May of 1915. So it's going to take 2 full years after the Lusitania before Americans decide to go to war in Europe. We have some close traditional ties to Great Britain, all right? And this cartoon kind of shows what we're talking about with respect to that. So one reason is Americans feel like their freedom of seas, the principle of freedom of seas, is being violated. The sinking of the Lusitania, and we have close ties to the Allies. We have close ties to Britain, right? We're once a British colony. This image showing, this is obviously Uncle Sam here. This is a figure in Europe called John Bull, who represents Great Britain. And you can see we have social ties here, right? We have ties of kinship, conservatism. We have mutual economic benefits. We have trade interests. Our civilizations are very similar. So we're all kind of tied together with respect to the British. So that's another reason why we might go on the side of the Allies. Another factor pushing Americans to war is British propaganda. All right, the Germans are portrayed as being brutal warriors. All right, here shown as the devil. Okay, here's a German military helmet, and this being the devil. Babies killed, children, women, non-combatants, a good month's business, right? They're trying to show Americans that these people are evil and they're not human. Just like we talked about when we did the Spanish-American War, all right? This idea that they are not humans. The Hun in the home, a bit of England, our homes are secure, our mothers and wives are safe, our children still play and fear no harm. Their homes are destroyed, their women are murdered, their children are dead as slaves. A bit of Belgium says, do you want this to happen to us? So the British are playing on American fears of German brutality. All right, the Zimmerman telegram. It was a telegram that was leaked to the U.S. press. German leaders offered U.S. territory to Mexico if it would side with Germany. So all these events that we're talking about are building upon one another, one after another, over 3 years, until the United States decides to go to war. All right, so we're going to watch this video quick.
One of the key turning points in World War I was the discovery of the Zimmermann telegram. The Zimmermann telegram was a German Foreign Ministry official communication sent by the German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to the German ambassador in Mexico City, asking him to open negotiations with the Mexican government about working with Germany in the war. Also alluded to a potential alliance with Japan if it would help Germany in the war against the United States. If it would help Germany in the war, Germany was offered to help Mexico gain back its territory lost to the United States in earlier conflicts. The telegram was intercepted by British intelligence, decoded, and shared with the United States, and it showed evidence that Germany was plotting with other countries to attack the United States. This was one of the significant reasons why the United States was provoked into entering the war.
Okay, guys, so now we're just going to take a look at this Zimmermann telegram. And how this is the decoded version of it. All right. So this is from the German minister to the Mexican government. It says, "We intend to begin on the 1st of February unrestricted submarine warfare. We shall endeavor or try to, in spite of this, to keep the United States of America neutral. In the event of this not succeeding, we make Mexico a proposal of alliance." So the Germans want to be allies with Mexico on the following basis. They want to make war together. They want to make peace together. There'll be some money in it for you, a generous financial support, and an understanding on our part that Mexico is to reconquer the lost territory in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. So, hey, if you want to be allies with us, we're going to give you back that territory that the United States stole from you in the 1840s. So this was an effort by the Germans to get another ally, and hopefully that ally would, help them to defeat the United States. So obviously Americans, when they read about the Zimmermann note, and this is one more step towards bringing the United States into the war in Europe. So just to recap, right, you have unrestricted submarine warfare, you have our close ties to Britain, the use of British propaganda, and now the Zimmermann telegram. You have all these issues that are kind of swirling around, and eventually they're enough to push Wilson towards war. Remember, Wilson did not want to go to war originally. As a matter of fact, he won the election in 1916 with his slogan, "He kept us out of war," and a few months later, he's asking for a declaration of war. So in April 2nd of 1917, Wilson goes to a joint session of Congress and asks for a declaration of war to make the world safe for democracy. So that's another reason why we go to war, because Wilson believes that we need to make the world safe for democratic governments and safe for freedom-loving peoples and things like that. So that's another cause. Even though it's part of his speech, it is a reason for U.S. involvement into the war in Europe. All right, so I'm going to try to play this video. Got to get it to 9:17. That's good enough.
On the afternoon of January 31st, 1917, the President received a diplomatic communiqué. The German government had declared all-out submarine warfare against American ships in the Atlantic. Then a telegram was intercepted that revealed Germany was trying to persuade Mexico to declare war against the U.S. by offering the states of Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico as potential war prizes.
The fact that Germany is sinking American ships, that it's plotting with Mexico to bring on war with the United States, causes Wilson to lose all faith in the good intentions of the German government.
Wilson called for an extraordinary session of Congress to receive a communication concerning grave matters of national policy. After days of agonizing, he had decided to declare war. Now he faced the monumental task of telling Americans why, after 3 years of advocating neutrality, he had changed his mind. He had to convince Americans that he had found something that was worth fighting and dying for. On April 2nd, Wilson stood before a joint session of Congress and asked for a declaration of war against Germany.
It is a fearful thing to lead this great, peaceful people into war. into the most terrible and disastrous of all wars. But the right is more precious than peace, and we shall fight for the things which we have always carried nearest our hearts. For the ultimate peace of the world and for the liberation of its peoples. The world must be made safe for democracy.
It's the greatest presidential speech, I think, since Lincoln's second inaugural address. Wilson believed that the United States was a very special nation, that we were really conceived in liberty, and that we had a mission in the world to try to make it a better place, to try to make it more peaceful, more just, more democratic.
He's often accused there of being hopelessly romantic and idealistic. I would argue all to the contrary, that Wilson, number one, had no real alternative but to cast the war on this plane of idealism, because none of his country's vital interests were really at stake. So he had somehow to convince the public that something was at stake here, and what was at stake was the nature of the democratic experiment itself, worldwide.
The address was met with wild applause, and Wilson's justification for going to war was greeted with enthusiasm. The old isolation is finished, the New York World declared. We are no longer aloof from the rest of the world. Whatever happens now concerns us, and from none of it can be withheld the force of our influence.
Okay, so the question is, do you believe the U.S. entrance into World War I was necessary? Just to run down the reasons again. Number one, unrestricted submarine warfare. Number two, our close ties to the British. Number three, British propaganda. Number four, the Zimmerman Note. And then finally, this idea that we have to go to war to make the world safe for democracy. All right, so those are the reasons. Now you have to decide, was it necessary or not? There are plenty of historians who think our involvement in World War I was not necessary. As a matter of fact, Professor Kennedy, at the end of the video clip, he says it was not, there was no real national interest in getting involved. Wilson makes it our national interest by saying we have to make the world safe for democracy. So you have to make a claim. You believe it's necessary or not necessary. Give your reasoning why, and then use the details from the PowerPoint to help answer the question or prove your claim and reasoning. All right? Good luck.